he really thought about architectural history as like the rings of a tree. And when he described this, it made a strong impact on me that the person that was working in the bakery also went and worshipped at the church, and he built his own house, and he understood that there was a local flavor and a local character that went across building types, not necessarily by analyzing individual building types. So if you look at the diagram here, you can see, there's town A, which has, maybe it's in the East Coast, and it has its own flavor and building, same with town B and town C. And these are the building types here. And kind of common practice, and I remember even in school at times falling into this trap in undergraduate, is where you start to say, well, gosh, I'm going to do the best mixed-use building. Can you ever see that? I'm going to do the best mixed-use building as possible, and I'm going to make sure that I've understood them all. And then your building doesn't necessarily respond to its context quite as much as it should. So really, when you think about it, you really want to be thinking about things this way. So when you're doing a kind of mixed-use building in a context, you should be looking at the local public buildings, the local residential buildings, and understanding how that, like that rings of a tree, how you can create that flavor. And then you're probably saying to me, Eric, well, that's great. Why on earth then am I going to architecture school and learning about all these great buildings like Ronchamp and Nebraska State Capitol, Portopia, and things like that? And the idea is yes, you have to understand there's always going to be invention. You're always going to be bringing in characteristics of your own daily life and the way in which modern requirements go into historic buildings, because that's the way things evolve. And so, but that's where you start to bring in the discussion of fabric architecture versus landmark architecture. In fabric architecture, what you're doing is you're doing it's pretty much about a major influence on these components, and then considering a very minor influence in invention. It's always going to be part of it, as we wish about understanding daily life. And then, I think the computer didn't have its coffee this morning, so we're going to keep it going. Architecture, and every city has this, where there's a considerable amount of invention and understanding of historic typologies in relation to that. So I'm just going to give you a quick case study of a project that we had done where we brought in a lot of these compositional techniques, and this will kind of roll into the first half of the session, where I'm going to cover kind of some basic techniques and components and how they could be applied to a mixed-use building and the compositional techniques. Yeah. It's a little dark. Yeah, we'll try this. We'll try the other light. We're getting this kind of lighting problem here.
Striping.
Striping. Can you guys read that? Is that better? Okay, no, it's not better. Okay. It's an unusual thing going on here now. Maybe if I just keep my arm here, it seems to go away. So we'll play with that for a minute here while we talk. So this kind of quick case study where you can describe where we're trying to think about that same era. The great era of architecture is really 1890 to 1940, where there was new building types and new typologies, but the architects were really trained in traditional manner and understanding. Oh, this is terrific. Okay. They were trained in their own. Chord's a little short. They were trained in understanding their own classical language and traditional languages, and at the same time they were able to invent to be part of new modern typology. So our project is a little bit fuzzy, but you can see it was on a high-profile road, and there was all these churches right across the street that were really remarkable, and then there was a historic building fabric around it. But it was a high-traffic corridor that it was between these transit stops in Pittsburgh here, and here's the downtown, and this building was a high-traffic corridor, so it had been lined with awful buildings like this one. So the property values were up very high, and people weren't expecting that. It was zoned for that. It was hard to make a case for a lower residential, but as it's not a corridor, it made sense to have a higher density. So, but on the same token, right across the street was some of those beautiful churches in Pittsburgh like this. And some of the residential houses of that neighborhood were, and everybody knows Mount Lebanon for its wonderful English Romantic architecture. So the question was, how do you marry those styles? So the invention that is going on here is kind of an example. Is what we did here. So what we had to do was try to consider how you bring together styles from and things that are not necessarily compatible, which was a challenge. So we learned our kind of basic architectural techniques of base and top, and then we kind of evolve them. I'll talk about that in a minute. We also kind of try to create kind of local symmetries, and at the same time, understanding how this kind of has almost the evocative shape of a house, or single-family residential house on top of a larger building. So it became a kind of flavor that goes together. In the site plan, this is actually a gateway to Mount Lebanon. When you drive up the hill, you actually see this kind of rising above you. So you can see the turrets of the church right across the street. So the idea is how we took the strategies that we learned, basic strategies, and then applied them in this particular context. We also have a second building down the way here. But, so that kind of will help kind of roll into some of the discussions that we can go through in our examples. Keep that going. So what I'll do is we provided you with 2 pieces of trace paper. There's more if you need some. And we're hoping that we're going to be just kind of drawing along some examples and ideas and let you guys learn some of these techniques if they're interesting to you. So the first thing in terms of composing a mixed-use building in actually almost any house, what we've noticed is that oftentimes people have the wrong paper size. I've seen that a lot, and I've actually noticed it in my own. Is that if you're when you're looking at like art, so if here's a picture and there's a beautiful, a little closer. There's a beautiful building, that kind of thing. If you're looking at the art, you want to be about 1/2 the diagonal away from it. So that dimension of that building in the drawing is how far you want to be away from it. So when you think about that, that's exactly the same thing when you're working on a mixed-use building. I've seen people laying out these buildings this large, and they're trying to compose something large, and you can't take it all in your own cone of vision. Michael Jordan had really good wide peripheral vision, in the basketball court. I don't, so I have to keep it kind of here. So think about that. Sometimes if you're struggling with the composition, maybe just change the scale of your drawing to something that's a little more comfortable. The other thing is choosing the right scale for what you're doing. Don't try to solve details at a small level. Solve those at a detail that, again, kind of fits your paper size in front of you. If you keep that in mind, you'll always do really well. So I'm going to go through some of the basics of some basic lessons, and I'll just write down the lesson, and then we'll kind of go through it. The one that I think is really important when you're doing mixed-use buildings is bring the top to the street. That's a really important lesson, and that you can find kind of across the board in great places like in Carmel and in great places like Santa Barbara that are kind of resort environments. You'll see that some of these things are not really real towns, but you'll see they often have really elaborate tops with balconies and all kinds of things. This kind of sense of human habitation, and oftentimes there's this kind of exaggerated scale at the top of the building that helps make the place feel like there's good kind of sense of human habitation. You see this a lot when, I'm just going to throw this example out. This is Lutyens, who was trained in the classical language, and he worked in England quite a bit. This is a building on Pall Mall. But you can see that this building he's doing something that I think is really an important one. So this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-story building. But what he's doing is he's married these 2 floors together. It's probably a 12th floor, and I think there was a mezzanine up front. But every floor is completely different when you look at it. So what that does is that brings down the scale of the building and brings it down to and then he's also done it in a kind of exaggerated top here. In fact, this is actually a scale of a kind of beautiful building in and of itself, and it's just kind of rested on top. The sense that there's balconies, these may not even be operable, but the sense that there's that sense of human habitation helps do that, bring that down in the sense of a really strong top. So when you look at any kind of good top architecture, is oftentimes when you look at you can look at it all the way around Buffalo. There's always these kind of exaggerated tops as well, in terms of scale. That's always a kind of key piece, whether or not it's modernism, traditional architecture, or what have you. And so that there's a number of different ways you can handle tops. You can handle them where they're kind of as just kind of like a really large kind of piece like that, or you can kind of start to do some subtraction, where you, like what I show here, like you put a trellis or something like that, and then kind of put a program on top here, and you can kind of create something like that. So you can do a number of things that kind of give you something for your eye to rest on and something up top. The other thing that I wanted to point out is when you're doing a building with a parapet, you can have that parapet closer, so here's your windows up top. So I'll probably need to draw that bigger. So if you have a building here, you have a top here, you can put your parapet a little bit closer to the top of these windows, if you have your windows here, than you would with if you have a cornice. If this is your cornice here, you can put that top a little bit closer than you would with a parapet. Parapet wall you want to put up here, and it almost exaggerate the amount of top. So when you look at a building like, say Lake Corbu, like Billy Darsh's, you have these crazy stripes, and then you have these kind of big openings in the strip. But you have this really enormous top to it. What that is what he had been trained in the classical language. So he knew that if you have a top like this, here's your window, is that when you're standing on the ground looking at it like that, you can actually project that up. Oh yeah, so you can actually read that up higher. So basically that is the extension of the cornice. So you want to think about things from the view from the ground. So you can also see that for those skyscraper designers in here. I'll tell you a little bit about that. So bringing the top of the street. So let's see. If you were to look at, say, the Chrysler building, something like that. You look at it from a distance, and it's you can't really see the whole thing, but you can see that it has this. This is has a huge proportion to it. And the idea is that when you look at it from the street, it comes. You would kind of be able to see the whole top when you're looking up at it. So that's the idea. So that this kind of becomes into the right scale. So when you look at a smaller building, it has the similar idea. So bringing the top of the street is something that I wanted to mention. The second one I wanted to tell you about is upsize your windows. That's another really important trick. Oftentimes, in modernism, the great gift of modernism to upsize windows. The great gift of modernism to architecture was the interconnectedness of the interior and the exterior. So why should we not take that into our own inheritance? So when you look at a building and it has these, if you try to put really small windows like that, and particularly today, sometimes we're trying to do more livable interiors and stuff like that, and we're trying to get as tall ceilings as we can. If you do really small windows, the exterior tends to not look as strong. So when I look at some early things that I was designing at UDA, I was doing this same problem. So this one has some things about some local symmetries, but you can see these windows are really small. But it looks a little warmer right here with the larger windows. So I think that, I started to realize that really it's important to keep the window size. So go ahead and, when you're doing these kinds of things, go ahead and do, really punch the windows up as large as you can. So it's sometimes you could do an 8-foot double hung window in a really large room. But when you start doing those larger, even just looking at this kind of this quick doodle, the larger windows, look better than the smaller windows. So part of making my sketch. But that would be the second thing. Second tip I would give you is use the material as intended. So when you're doing a Charlie Barrett said something to me that was pretty remarkable is that he said that architecture is not necessarily the art of construction, it's the art of the representation of construction. So what we mean by that, I think to me, is if you have a masonry building, and the whole, this also goes a little bit to the Louis Sullivan phrase, form follows function, which is probably the most misunderstood phrase in all of architecture. When he said form follows function, it didn't mean that that function is more important than form. It meant that a skyscraper should look like a skyscraper, a brick building should look like a brick building. And it was some way of getting at this kind of, and I know modernists are sometimes very frustrated by a kind of a lack of a sense of authenticity, like Mount Vernon may bother them because it's a wood building looking like a stone building. And if you can design like Mount Vernon, you wouldn't be in this class. So I'm not necessarily saying that this goes as a total rule, because there's a lot of times there's hope and there are a lot of wood details that are invented to look like stone buildings. There's all that kind of thing. But just as a general principle, and what I mean by that about why use the material as intended is that in a wood structure you can do, let's say, you can do 5 windows, 5 windows together, and knowing that the wood framing is going between the windows, like that. So that's something that you can see in wood, but you wouldn't see it in stone. So do your best to avoid that kind of thing. When you're working in stone, you want to go ahead and think, or brick or masonry or whatever. Think about the fact that there's a certain amount of distance in between it when brick is important. So, or having the right amount of stone. That's usually about, you can get down to the point where you can get like 3 brick courses in between a window. And then if so, you want to think about, well, okay, I'll merge these together and I'll put some sort of expression of something that can bring the window together. I don't know if that makes sense. But, so the distance here between these two, once you get less than half the window, you might want to just pull the windows together. So you got to watch that. That's something I would recommend. And then the other thing is in stone, or masonry, generally when you get more than 3 windows wide in composing a facade, you really need to think about the fact that the expression of that lintel needs to be large enough to feel like it can go. Now, so yeah, you may be saying, oh, Eric, when we got a brick building, it's wood framing underneath and so forth like that. It's just kind of a natural compositional technique that probably makes more sense. The other thing is that when you're working in a material, so for instance, if you're working in a stone facade, it's important to find the right time to switch over materials. So if you're doing if you're thinking about a facade that needs to have a massing-wise, you want to bump out. So you have a room on the base of a building. Here's your building, and you're gonna pop something out like that. Think about making that in an alternative material to make it read like this is a masonry opening in the building. So here's the windows here. So you may want this to read like maybe it's a stone. Maybe it goes to steel, some of that, or wood. So that way, the masonry building next to it reads stronger. Let me show you an example of that as well. Kind of when you... sorry, misplaced that one. But nevertheless, switching materials is a critical... understanding where to switch your materials. So for example, let's go back to this one for a second. If you were doing a brick building, and we're working on some buildings in Detroit like this, where we have, right here we have a pair of double hung windows. And then you go to 5 windows. This is changing over to it's an industrial area. This is changing over to steel at this point. So we have steel panels. So if you have to group windows, consider changing your material and following that along. So that would be the next lesson. So another one is kind of one thing that I see oftentimes as a mistake is watch your corners. This goes to the same thing as the wood consideration, is that there's a point at which you, like we see this all the time, where if you're doing a window here, staying away. keep in mind that the window, there's a certain dimension of which you can't get any closer, and you need to start thinking about changing your language. So, for instance, here with masonry, I'd say that it's one of those things where you want to think about it just kind of 1/2 to 2/3 the width of the window, and you start getting too close. When you get to 1/2, it really gets too close. And same thing with wood framing too, because when you think about wood, sometimes you're going to trim out a window. It may even be more, because back historically what they did is they would have balloon framing or they have regular framing, wood framing. They need to be able to give that some shear with some diagonals there. So you want to keep your window away from the corner as much as possible, because when you think about it, when you start to go ahead and lay this out, you need to have enough siding there to fit around the corner. So if you have to go into the corner, which you do sometimes, with the same thing that we just designed with, or we just laid out in Detroit, the same discussion where you go ahead and you might gang windows together, and that might become a special component of your building in the mason. So you group them together so it looks intentional, so it looks like, and that also allows you to kind of have, you also would wrap that around the corner too. So if this was a perspective, you go ahead and do that. And wrap around the corner there. So that way you get corner views and things like that. Okay, the big one I think is and this is where we start getting a more important component, is give the eye a rest when you're designing. It's kind of a funny phrase, the eye a rest. The important thing about that is when you're looking at compositions, is that you sometimes have repetitive elements, and those repetitive elements are then stopped by hierarchical elements. So just that shape right there is something that every once in a while you need something for your eye to kind of rest on. And I'll show you a couple examples of those in buildings. But when you think about that as kind of an architectural facade composition, then you might have a building that maybe has, say, it's 3 stories tall, and we'll work on one similar to this in a second. Then you have, there may be a tower, something like that. So this is kind of where your eye is resting compared with the repetitive elements next to it. You can see this a lot in even modern compositions. John Hedrick, guy out of New York, he would do these things where you do 2, kind of, and then maybe you do these compositional diagrams where you have a hierarchical element, 2 symmetrical elements next to it. Same thing with Michael Graves. When you look at his, Michael Graves gave a lecture when I was an undergraduate. He kept showing composition after composition of just simple, 2 simple forms and a hierarchical form. And he used to show, this in kind of art, historic art, and so forth. And when you look at his plans, you would oftentimes do that. You might have 2 buildings that, face each other, and then it would be that. So that's the kind of basic floor plan layout. So you can see this time and time again. So when you look at it, so like even when you look at Leon Creer's work, you might do a temple, form. This is on. And then next to it, you might do a some sort of like tower like this. You'll see that kind of thing. But then you look at, okay, well, let's go to that New England church. Gibsonian church, or repetitive elements, or something like that. Wow. So so you see this. So you can go from architecture to architecture, and there's that similar strategy that when you give your eye a kind of break. So even when you're designing a repetitive building, and that's the kind of next lesson is that you need to give yourself. You give something a break. So we're seeing buildings that need a little bit of help. It's oftentimes that. So there's some basic strategies for compositions for mixed-use buildings, and then we're going to get into a kind of finish on a high note with Eric in residential architecture. And some of these strategies will go there as well, but in the thinking. So, the pretty simple one is okay, well, let's just break it down into 5 simple ones. There's nothing wrong with that fabric. And then when you think about the composition of a whole street, you may think about having a something to kind of balance it out and to kind of give your eye rest in that location. So this is one composition. The other one, and these are kind of brutally abstract, but there's also kind of emphasis of the end bays. And that might be where you're giving that, giving. So these might be example, they may be heavier, and then you have, that kind of thing. So you can see that all over the place. I was looking out, there's a Liberty building just down the street here in Buffalo. Same thing, it has a kind of top, these ziggurat tops, Statue of Liberty on top. Dave Schott, who's in here, was telling a story. There's like some sort of German, thing going on, and then they had the German banking thing or something like that, and then they, World War I, the Germans were kind of out of favor at the moment, so they turned into the Liberty building. So again, same kind of thing where you have, emphasis on the end bays. So that's composition 2. Composition 3 might be more where you have a kind of focus on the center bay. And this may be 1 bay, it may be 3 bays, but there's more emphasis here than there are on the end bays, so your eye is going to the center of the drawing. So that's composition 3. And then when you start, okay, once you kind of get those down, you can start having a little more fun, and then saying, well, okay, I want to break this down. I want to have this 4th bay have maybe there's a street that's kind of coming up, and you got a building here, and you want to punch out that bay there. So you may want to have a relationship to that. So you may want to have this 4th bay. So you can once you kind of get the structure, you can decide where you want to put that emphasis there. So that's kind of a general strategy. Now I'm going to get into real quick how the composition. Oh, so if you're composing a street, okay. So when you look at the kind of, can everybody see that? You look at the skyline of a city. So let's just take Chicago. There's buildings and all kinds of things. And then there's Trump's Tower, and Standard Oil is over here, and then then there's like Sears Tower, so things like that. So there's instead of it just being a pure mound, there's areas of which your eye is resting on. You look at New York, and there's kind of Midtown, and then there's Wall Street area and stuff like that. It's just kind of a logical sweep. Part of that has to do with some geology and things like that. But I guess the Empire State Building's in there somewhere. But nevertheless, when you look at them, there's areas which your eye can rest on them. So when you're designing laying out a street, if you're doing that kind of thing, and you've got a number of buildings you want to lay out, is sometimes you may do, okay, well, I'll do a symmetrical building here, maybe another symmetrical building here. Then every once in a while, introducing kind of something with a hierarchy. So balancing, symmetrical, and asymmetrical can oftentimes, and again, I'm saying this let's keep in mind what we talked about early on about understanding your own context, but it's oftentimes just kind of good practice to have a place where your eye, like I was saying, giving your eye a rest. So here's just a street at which we were working on in Silvertip, Canada. Pierre Carlo Bontempi was doing some buildings to the side. Van Creer was doing a temple. We have a symmetrical facade here. This is somewhat symmetrical. We have a little hierarchical element. This building kind of sits on a plaza and it's again a 5-bay facade that we then, same idea at the top, and then we kind of took this 5th bay and highlighted that. And then we put a little accent mark on this bay number 1 here. So the idea is asymmetrical, symmetrical, symmetrical. Okay, so does everybody have, I wanted to take steps of what we would do if we were, does everybody have one of these? There's about 30 of them out there. There's some trace papers you want to share with your neighbors or you can follow along. So we're going to apply our techniques, and you can apply them any way you feel it. You don't have to do anything that I'm doing today. But so the idea here is I take you through a little bit of the steps in which what I would be doing if I was designing a building. So I've got a floor plan here, just a little diagram floor plan. There's a living room, and there's some bedrooms. So this is a one-bedroom unit on the corner, the living room in the corner. There's bedroom, living room, bedroom, and then there's these kind of another two-story unit that wraps around the corner. That's a living room, bedroom, bedroom. So the first thing we do when we're designing a building is generally, oftentimes mixed-use buildings, you have to do your best, get it sited correctly where it needs to sit in order to do what it needs to do to make a street. And then there's oftentimes a developer program you have to consider. So you're kind of sometimes stuck within a framework. So the idea is to kind of try to do as much as you can with the elevation while you have it. So the way in which we approach things is that, and Eric's going to take you through the evolution of a floor plan and how that becomes a really rich elevation, which I think is critical. But we oftentimes do a section elevation. So what you're looking at is basically the building. This is the facade. So here's the street. This ground level, this is an A scale, and that's the other thing is what I mentioned about choosing the right scale. This is a retail base, and you can see we've got 16 feet for that. Just as a tip, if you're designing buildings, 16 feet is a good size because oftentimes retailers will want to. It's nice to have really tall ceilings, operable transom windows up above to let the light down. And you can do some really interesting things with light shelves that bounce light off the ceiling and things like that. Oftentimes they can be fans and help move the spaces. But having retail spaces that are really tight and stuff like that can work in some really unique contexts. But generally, it's keep as high as you can to get that light deeper in the store. So, for instance, this building, because it's double loaded, which is not my favorite. We like to do a single loaded as much as possible. Single loaded meaning that there's a corridor and that there's a corridor that's on a light well in the back or something like that. So when they are double loaded, which is a kind of inhumane, actually, interestingly enough, we did some work in India where we were able to get extremely high densities with single loaded buildings and all kinds of things. It's interesting that there's a perception that double loaded is actually more density, but nevertheless, they get extremely deep. So you want to try to get as much light as possible. That's why it's important to have that dimension. I'm also just going ahead and putting a little sandwich of 1 foot plus for the structure. Could be up to 2 feet. There's a living room. This living room, this story, I've got a 10 foot and another 10 foot. So that's kind of our basic structure. So this is kind of the way we start when we're composing an elevation of a building that's already fixed. And really, if you want to move really quickly, lay it out in SketchUp and then just print the SketchUp model in elevation at scale. So what I always look at first is I've got a bedroom, living room, bedroom, bedroom, living room at the end. So is to try to create kind of something of trying to give that some sort of repetition or to set up something at the end or set up some sort of move. So just first of all, I'm going to go ahead and say, well, look, these are a logical place to put bays because I can't put windows on that structure of that. So I've got a larger bay at the end, and I've got a slightly larger bay at this end. Now this living room is a little bit bigger, so you can kind of fudge that bay there. So you got your 4 bays. So I'm just going to think, well, I got that same thing. Well, I really want to make something large enough that reads as bays. So sometimes I just draw a diagram. And one thing I wanted to also encourage you is always, there's two steps to do, is get your kit of parts. Get your kit of parts, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other thing is get a diagram that works. And Eric will talk about this too, is do not, and I'm just going to go through this for 5 minutes. We're just going to get to a diagram, and then I'm going to tell you how, because I want to make sure that Eric has enough time. But is always if you can get your diagram working really well, you can add stuff no matter what, all these different languages, and it's going to be a great looking building from there on out. So always keep working until your diagram looks good in just its pure form. And then, so don't try to add detail too quickly. We see that constantly, people come around to school and they're working out all the windows on this one bay, and they're getting all the thing out, getting all the details out, and then you say, well, what, and then they start, and they go, oh wow, this really didn't look that good. Well, if you have the good diagram, you're going to be golden. So going back to this thing about getting the good, so you kind of create so I'm going to go ahead and create a diagram here. I'm going to get the four bays here, and then I might just say, okay, well, one of the things about a deep building like this is that the roof, you don't want to just go ahead and roof a 65-foot building like this because it looks really flat. It's like something I can see on the suburbs. So oftentimes you got to pull and push and pull a little bit. So you might say, okay, well we're going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to give it a gable on this end. So looking at this end, I'm going to do that. Maybe I pull that up a little bit on this end to kind of punctuate that bay. Maybe I'll do the same here. So I've got two tall bays here. It's going to help turn the corner that direction. And then maybe I'll go ahead and say, well, let me go ahead and put a larger bay on that end. Building entries are really critical. So let's go ahead and put something on the corner. A really fun entry here. And then think about how these things then shape the diagram here. I'm going to clean up this diagram. And then I'm going to show you our kit of parts. I'm going to turn this over to Big Fish, Eric Osth. So what we've got is we've got a highlighted bay here, and then we've got a big bay here. So then I've got some extra room. Maybe this needs a little bit of some other windows here. Maybe a little bit of wall here might give us and then to kind of reinforce the symmetry. Maybe there's a window here that then sits over this one. So I'll go through that again. So I kind of diagram like that. I kind of figure like that's kind of the way to start. And then to kind of think about that, then you kind of clean up your diagram. Clean that up pretty simply. And then just kind of think about that. And then, okay, so these are. So I've got these kind of repetitive bays right now. And I want to highlight that, this is getting a little too repetitive now. I'm thinking to myself, why don't I go ahead and put some balconies on these four? And I've got these. And these retail things, they actually may be much wider than I'm drawing because you can usually get a pretty light base. And I've got a kind of fun corner condition here. Maybe I got a corner door. Always make sure you do a good job in the corner of the building. It's usually what's seen the most. In fact, if you can do, when you're thinking of your investments for a building, of where you want to spend your money, when you do a beautiful building and then the cost comes back, and then you pick your client up off the floor, and then you figure out where you want to spend your money. You want to spend your money here at the base, because that's where the pedestrians see it. This is general, and then you want to spend it at the top. So anything in between can get a little bit more economical. And then obviously, this goes without saying, when you look at great urban buildings, oftentimes the backs are the cheapest material that's sided. So that kind of goes without saying. But anyway, so I've got maybe a door and a balcony here, and then maybe a little window, and then a little window here. So let's look at our diagram again. Look at that. And keep looking at your diagram. Take it off of there. See how it's going. So you're starting to get some shape. Put a base on it here. Okay, so what's the next step? So you get a diagram that you like, and so you kind of establish your kit of parts. You've got a balcony. Figure out your balcony design. And this balcony design may be based on something that's designed locally that you've seen in the neighborhood, and then it's also maybe it's something that you know that you can build in terms of affordability. You kind of get your kit of parts of windows, so maybe there's some great casement windows that your client is willing to afford. They're just really, really terrific stuff. I love those windows. Then maybe you've got a nice doorway. It's full light glass. Maybe there's some panes of glass. So you kind of line up your kind of things that you use, and then you apply that And typically we will go ahead and we'll go ahead and Photoshop, just to kind of move things along if you are really in a crunch. So you can go ahead and create an underlay by drawing it once and then kind of photoshopping it across the facade if you really need to go quickly. And you can see design your bay, balconies and so forth on there. And then maybe you got your doorway here on this guy, on your window. So you can kind of get, once you get yourself set there, maybe you roof line and you have your eave, knowing that the eave is going to give you, the eave is going to, because your window's here, you know the eave is going to give you that cornice, configuration. Your window's here, it's going to give you that configuration there. And maybe you got your storefront down below, and you can go ahead and put your transom in here. You can do some shaped work in the masonry there. You got your bag, and then you kind of drop your bag across the building. So then you say, well, one thing in buildings like this at a distance, going back to your diagram, sometimes it's nice to have a skyline, and like we talked about the sense of human temptation, you need somewhere for Santa to come down. So if you can get some fireplaces into these units, you can actually vent them out the exterior. Sometimes they also need venting in the roofs, so you can kind of get that, so you can kind of tuned up. So this roof is kind of turning the corner there, and then these, you use big assemblies, and maybe this window actually is one of these. So sometimes it's oftentimes important to kind of get something up in these gable forms too. So it's amazing how sloppy I draw when I'm trying to move quickly and I'm a little bit nervous. So anyway, so that's how I would approach a mixed-use building.